The episode begins with the crew of the Orion watching a screen while the computer gives them updates on something called overkill. And it delivers. They are not overselling on the name there. McClane is naturally a little horrified by the power to rip an entire hunk out of a planet like that. But the tech guy here says one day it might be critical against the frogs. They did throw a burning planet at us once. You might need to get a little something called overkill when that is your mortal enemy. Back on Earth, the bigwigs have gathered once again for a serious topic. The attempted desertion of one of their finest commanders, Pietro, to the frogs no less, at AC-1000. They've looked the guy over, and there is no reason whatsoever for him to do this. Nothing physically compromising at all. And when they bring the poor dope in, he has no idea why he was suddenly flying to rendezvous with their mortal enemies. This, says Yegelov's boss, is the latest good reason why we should put robots in charge of our ships instead of relying on human beings who might betray us, because we've no history of robots having problems ever. Afterwards, McClane tries pumping Van Dyke for info since Pietro's his friend, so any other pumping is going to have to wait till later. Yegelov's is actually watching them with her own date for the evening.
Reden wir über sie? Man hört, sie seien eine ziemliche Schreckschraube.
No, that was more of a Molly than a bitch. The funny thing is that while she can't keep her eyes off McClane, he can't keep his eyes off her, though even Van Dyke notes that it's hard to tell whether or not they're just trying to vaporize each other with their gazes. But when she gets called away, he chooses to go with his typical fallback option, crawl inside somebody else's head. So he tells Yegelov's date that Van Dyke needs this yahoo to go report to her right away. Possibly a special assignment or something. Possibly so he can carry away this great big can of fuck off. After bickering a little, McClane explains about the space madness problem as he likes to describe what happened with Pietro, and apparently it affects everyone who goes to M8812. Although it does sound like the start of a country western song, doesn't it? Everyone at M8812 gets the space madness. But she does him one better. Her boss is making sure that there's a physician on board, which ruffles McClane's feathers like a gray-crowned crane at a noogie contest. That joke works a lot better if you're obsessed with birds. Fortunately, after the introduction, the new doctor and McClane size each other up and seem to accept that they're both professional enough to work together. Though McClane finds it hard to believe that Pietro willingly was trying to defect just because they can't find anything medically wrong with him. That's why the doc's here, to see if they also try to defect. And why, which furthers McClane's foul mood. Not helping is that M8812 isn't answering when they show up. We see the robots are there, and eventually they get off their shiny metal asses and activate the automatic landing controls. When our heroes show up, they note that the robots don't seem to be doing much. No status reports or anything. They're just hanging out. So Atan is told to take a look inside.
Schmelz ihn zusammen! Er hat schwere Störung!
Keep up the good work, Atan. Gotta say, for a robot with don't harm humans as its first law, the robot seems to be doing a fine job of menacing people. The doctor discusses this little problem with McClane, actually, and they can only conclude that it must be sabotage. So they better deal with the other one just to be sure, and preferably just turning it off rather than shooting it like the first one. Doesn't look good if you attend a lecture on robotics and at the end conclude put a hole in it is the same as off switch. Hasso doesn't want to do this, though. He thinks Yegelov's would be better, and that's a good idea. She knows a lot about robots. She's probably the only human who could hold a deep conversation with R2-D2. Well, the doctor, at one point McClane calls him professor, so this could be a mistranslation again, and he's not a medical doctor. Or he is a medical doctor and he's also a professor, or he's actually Sylvester McCoy in disguise. Anyway, the doctor notes how strange it is that not only are they having robot problems, but Helga's attempt to contact another base fails. 2 unrelated technical malfunctions, Plus, they need to install that whole overkill thing. So the pair of them crawl inside the Jeffries tubes. Oh, I suppose it's Jeffries tubes since we're in Germany, to try to find the problem. But there is one, up on the ship, where Hasso is on duty since Yegolovsk is down here dealing with the robot. When they call him up, he seems to have fallen asleep in his chair, and after looking curiously at the computer earlier. Either he's found a way to dispense beer from it, and I wouldn't put it past him, or something weird is going on here. Yes, I don't count putting a half keg in a computer as something weird. I'd do it myself if I could figure out a way to keep them both ice cold without water dripping on anything vital. It'd ruin the beer. That's usually me about 3 a.m. every Saturday, just as I get the show finished. When they get back, McLean teases the doctor that this was a waste of the man's time. Nothing's unusual going on with his crew trying to mutiny or anything. The downside is, much as McLean enjoys gloating, because let's face it, it's at the top of the list right next to having sex and drinking, and preferably he'd like to do all three at once. If nothing happens, though, that means that Petro has no explanation as to why he deserted other than the obvious, and that doesn't sit well with McLean at all. The doctor swings by and talks to Hasso, no doubt noticing how outside the norm his behavior was, although his very presence does seem to set Hasso on edge. Finally, he just blurts out in desperation to McLean to get them the hell out of here already. But that's when McLean discovers the impossible. There's a card in the computer output that so shocks him, he immediately locks everything down and tells Yegolovsk to get up here. There's a card with coordinates setting course for AC 1000. By the book, Yegolovsk is now in charge of the ship and the investigation, and she immediately concludes Hasso is to blame. Kind of a short investigation. She gives him the third degree, and the doctor is intent on watching how Hasso responds. Hasso naturally claims ignorance, but she points out that he was alone on the ship for 12 hours. There's no one else who could have done it but him, and it just gets angrier and angrier while accusing him, and he has no idea what she's talking about. It's like a German spaceship version of woman yelling at cat. When Yegolovsk starts calling it stuff like disgusting treason, McLean's finally had it and steps in. Hasso would never commit treason either. But she's convinced and makes a note in the log that he's being arrested and pulls her gun, planning to paralyze him to ensure that he cannot commit further sabotage. And I gotta say, that's the worst. I would not want to be paralyzed around friends like these. You'll wish they'd only drawn dicks on your face, not actually wiped real ones all over it. Helga steps in and really lays into Yegolovsk. She just bombs this woman while the blonde just rolls her eyes. So Helga finally lays out her bombshell. There's exactly as much proof against Hasso as there is against Yegolovsk herself. Because remember, for a while, she was alone on the ship too, until he came aboard. Well, she refuses to accept that, but the others note Helga's point, and Helga is willing to go so far as to take the gun away and paralyze Yegolovsk herself if she has to. So the doctor finally steps in to try and bring some logic into all of this. One of the two of them being a traitor? Yes, that would be the most likely. But then add in the technical problem with communication, the behavior of the robot, Pietro's inexplicable attempt, and suddenly there has to be other, more sinister possibilities than just some traitor.
Ursachen, die...
Or this whole thing could just be Mario's fault. I wouldn't be surprised. The doctor says that this is no longer a matter for security, but for medical expertise, and so he takes over. Presumably he's not going to shoot anyway. He questions Mario, who has no idea what he just did, confirming the doctor's suspicions. The computer is actually to blame, possibly because of all the beard hiding inside of it. To demonstrate, he tells Yegolovsk to go and look at it, and sure enough, she does it too, entering the coordinates. The only explanation is that something has affected the computer to create this compulsion, Probably some kind of telenosis, he says, broadcasting commands into the human brain. Lucky thing we've got a weapon called overkill. That's a weapon that I want to use against an enemy that tries to mess with my thoughts. In fact, that's going easy on them. I'd be all in favor of going with the ass auger after that, or even the fist of an angry god. Well, this proves Pietro innocent, but why stop there? The frogs are expecting the Orion after all. If they head to AC-1000, they'll be able to arrive without having to worry about an attack. The frogs are going to want the technology and the prisoners after all. Of course, the people back home shit themselves when they hear what's happening, not aware that this is all part of a plan, and so they're going to attack the Orion before it gets the chance to defect. However, there's only one ship that can hope to catch it, the Hydra, General Van Dyke's ship, and the one that McClane's crew managed to save, remember. She is not happy with these orders, but the crew seems to be convinced that McClane's people really are defecting. And it is hard to jump to any other conclusion. I mean, he's like a child with chocolate frosting all over his face and hands, insisting he never got any birthday cake. The Orion crew is trying to figure out what to do about this. It's hard to come up with a plan when you're role-playing as drooling, brainwashed fools. Soon they spot the frogs following them. Much like how the frogs' physical appearance back in the first episode used their limited special effects to great effect as far as atmosphere went, so too does the movement of their ships. It's just so unnatural. It's almost like they're being moved by computers. It's starting to bring back the creepiness factor that was starting to leak out of the show. Van Dyke still argues with her crew. She seems to be ready to do the deed, but only if she feels that she's given McClane every chance to prove he's the officer she knows he is. That is, until the moment that she realizes, with the frogs' immunity to their technology, they'll never get a shot off anyway. So she orders them to head back to Earth. Oh well, we got close, but horseshoes and hand grenades, I guess. So the Orion 8 is free to head in, with enough power to fire overkill for 4 seconds. Not much, but the name suggests that should be plenty. Limiting overkill has to at least give you some kill, maybe even excessive kill, despite not necessarily reaching extreme kill or overkill itself. Well, it works all right, and while the base is destroyed, the frogs are not happy. Still, there's enough overkill left over to eliminate them, too. But this victory comes at a terrible price. This is what you make if you wanted to parody the dancing of white people. The episode is good, although I think it might have benefited from a little trimming, and a bit more of the atmospheric music. The mood of the piece is where Space Patrol's greatest strength lies. The contrasting views towards Yegolovsk, at one point clearly as much of the crew as any of them are, and at another point clearly an outsider not to be trusted, demonstrates the series itself having a mistrust for what she represents, rather than of the woman herself. The idea of regimented rules and the subversive forces that will enforce them for good or for ill. Yegolov's character path is the recognition that the system she believes in is not about getting the best outcome, it's about protecting the asses of those in charge. To micromanage the decisions that people need to make to deal with a serious and fluid situation, so that if they deviate, it can always be blamed that they refuse to follow the protocol. The good leaders that we see are the ones who allow the commanders a degree of latitude to get the job done. The reassignment to Space Patrol was them yanking the leash of McClane to say, use your good judgment, but you've got to stop acting like you do whatever the hell you want out here. So yeah, this fit in very well with the character path that Yegolovsk is on. Note how, at first, she seems to have finally become a member of the crew. They trust her. They are perfectly happy leaving her in command of the ship while they're gone, and they recognize her expertise in dealing with a crisis and have no problem calling her up and saying, hey, you're the best person to do this job. Even the barbs that McClane throws at her in the bar are nowhere near where they were when they first started out. It's more of the good-natured stuff like we saw between Mario and Atan last time. It's when the crisis emerges that she becomes just like the people back home who second-guess everything. Remember, the episode starts out by showing us their reaction to Pietro's apparent defection, even though he insists that he doesn't know what they're talking about. The moment that she thinks that Hasso did it, she acts just like them, even hurling insults at him in the process. And that's the moment when they stop treating her as a member of the crew and as an adversary, not because she's doing her job, but because she's doing her job the way that the not quite so good leaders back home do their jobs. They don't trust the crews that they send out there. And her mistrust of the crew consequently leads to their mistrust of her. Her recognizing that she was wrong will, of course, go some way towards mitigating that. But how much that's going to continue to scar things in future episodes? We'll just have to wait till next time to find out.